Crimea was engineered to be an impenetrable fortress. It was the vital artery feeding the entire Russian southern war machine. It stood as a heavily fortified sanctuary, a massive logistical hub, and the primary military bridge connecting Russian territory directly to the brutal battlefronts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk. But that illusion of absolute security is systematically being dismantled. It is not being destroyed by one massive explosion, but by a quiet, calculated strangulation of the regional logistics network. The safe zone is now being hunted piece by piece. For months, the world focused heavily on the Kerch Bridge. It was the ultimate symbol of Moscow projecting immense power. But the strategic picture has rapidly shifted. Ukrainian forces are no longer staring at a single concrete target. The pressure is aggressively expanding across the entire peninsula. The crosshairs now rest on railway networks, road bridges, ferry crossings, fuel depots, power stations, supply trains, and military convoys moving between Mariupol, Melitopol, and Crimea. This geographical expansion of the target list is what makes the current reality uniquely dangerous for Russian commanders. Ukraine does not need one dramatic war-ending strike to sever Crimea from the front lines. They have initiated a slower, quieter, and fundamentally more damaging methodology. They are making every single Russian supply route harder to use, harder to protect, and terrifyingly easy to track. Logistics dictate the tempo of modern combat. If fuel cannot reach the advancing tank columns, the armor stops. If ammunition convoys are paralyzed, the artillery batteries fall silent. If supply ferries stop for emergency repairs, the front line begins to bleed long before the territorial map even registers a change. The campaign sweeping across Crimea is no longer just about shattering one famous bridge. It is about actively degrading the entire ecosystem that keeps the Russian southern offensive alive. Historically, Moscow treated this peninsula as far more than occupied territory. It served as a protected rear base where fuel could move forward unimpeded. Ammunition could be stockpiled in massive quantities. Aircraft and naval assets could launch operations from heavily guarded sanctuaries. Commanders utilized Crimea as a secure pipeline bridging the Russian homeland with the active battlefield. But previous precision strikes forced a massive logistical adaptation. Russia had to scatter the supply routes across a complex web of secondary roads, alternative rail lines, ferry links, hidden depots, and temporary crossings. Spreading out the logistics helped Moscow avoid total reliance on one fragile route. However, it also accidentally generated a massively expanded target list for Ukrainian operators. A decentralized supply system might be harder to annihilate in a single blow, but it is infinitely harder to guard around the clock. Every new detour requires mobile air defense, electronic warfare jammers, specialized repair crews, fuel trucks, and military police. Protection itself has transformed into an unsustainable operational burden. When movement itself becomes a lethal vulnerability, the entire foundation of a military campaign begins to fracture. Kyiv is no longer strictly hunting fixed concrete targets. They are deliberately disturbing the vital flow of war. A shattered bridge can eventually be repaired. A damaged ferry can return to service. A severed rail line can be patched by engineering teams. But when all of these transit nodes are placed under constant synchronized threat, the Russian logistical machine is forced to move slower, plan more cautiously, and expose far more vehicles along the transit corridors. A heavily loaded fuel truck waiting near a disabled crossing suddenly becomes highly visible. A supply train forced to halt its route becomes incredibly easy to track. A specialized repair team working immediately after a strike becomes just another indicator that the system is buckling under pressure. In modern asymmetric warfare, movement itself has become a high-value target. A pivotal battle can be decided before heavy armor ever meets on open ground. Russia does not merely lose combat effectiveness when a T-72B3 tank is obliterated by an anti-armor missile. It loses offensive momentum when that exact tank fails to receive diesel on time. The recent surgical strikes near Rozdolne and Vladislavivka perfectly illustrate this tactical evolution. Operators from the 413th Raid Regiment of the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces successfully hunted and struck 2 Russian locomotives deep inside occupied Crimea. To an outside observer, a locomotive might sound less significant than a burning fuel depot or a collapsed bridge span. But for a military doctrine built entirely around railway logistics, locomotives are catastrophic losses. They are the irreplaceable engines that keep thousands of tons of military cargo moving. Without them, heavy fuel cars, packed ammunition wagons, and critical spare parts remain completely stationary, even when the steel rails remain perfectly intact. Geography magnifies the severity of this strike. Rozdolne and Vladislavivka sit directly on the critical railway line running from Jankoy toward Kerch, and ultimately toward the Kerch Strait. This exact route connects the eastern gate of the peninsula with the broader rail network pumping military supplies deep into northern Crimea. Jankoy operates as one of the most vital rail hubs in the region. When the locomotives operating on this specific corridor are eliminated, the damage ripples outward. It shatters delivery timing, forces complex route alterations, and artificially creates extreme pressure at stations already buckling under a heavy wartime load. Rail transport is undeniably valuable because it moves sheer mass in a way truck convoys simply cannot replicate. A single train hauls massive volumes of diesel, artillery shells, armored vehicles, and engineering materials with minimal personnel and zero road congestion. But that historical strength becomes a fatal vulnerability when Ukrainian FPV drones can reach the locomotives, the junctions, and the moving trains themselves. A truck convoy under fire can scatter across fields. A massive supply train cannot. It is permanently bound to steel tracks, forced through known stations, and locked into highly predictable transit points. Ukrainian drone teams are exploiting this exact predictability, utilizing complex relay links to bypass electronic interference. FPV drones are flying deep into Crimean airspace. They follow the railway tracks, penetrate weak spots in the localized air defense network, and strike at the exact moment when the cargo is most exposed. A single, highly accurate drone suddenly matters more than a sprawling, multi-million-dollar defense array. A static depot can be hidden, hardened, or relocated under the cover of darkness. A massive locomotive must operate out in the open. Before we go deeper, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to channel for more clear analysis on the weapons, battles, and geopolitical shocks shaping the war today. A destroyed locomotive forces a catastrophic shift in logistical geometry. Cargo must now flow onto the asphalt, precisely where Ukrainian operators have laid a sprawling, multi-layered trap. Russian commanders face a brutal dilemma. They must decide whether to drastically reduce the speed of resupply, shift heavy cargo onto highly vulnerable truck convoys, or pull critical air defense systems away from the front line to protect the rail network. Every single option adds severe friction to a system already operating at maximum capacity. The pressure bleeding from the rail network naturally overflows onto the parallel road systems. The Kerch-Jankoy rail line operates as the primary skeletal structure distributing heavy military cargo into the southern theater. When Ukrainian strikes hit the railway bridge crossing the North Crimean Canal, the damage triggered a massive logistical shockwave. A damaged bridge forces massive supply trains to halt, reroute, or wait for extensive engineering inspections. These localized disruptions create massive cargo backlogs. Artillery shells, diesel reserves, and mechanized infantry units sit idle when they are desperately needed at the zero line. But the Russian military cannot simply transfer this immense volume of cargo from rail to road without falling into another carefully designed kill zone. The R-280 highway, heavily utilized as the Novorossiya highway, links Rostov with Mariupol, Melitopol, and the Crimean Peninsula. On paper, this coastal corridor offers Moscow a robust backup plan to keep the war machine fed when the railways fail. In reality, persistent Ukrainian drone strikes have transformed this critical lifeline into a sprawling graveyard for fuel trucks and military convoys. This is the trap closing around the Russian military apparatus. Rail lines and highways are engineered to support one another. If a train is delayed, truck convoys can rush urgent deliveries. If a highway becomes congested, rail systems can move heavy equipment with fewer vehicles. But when both logistical arteries are systematically severed at the exact same time, the illusion of a reliable backup plan evaporates. Rerouting heavy cargo onto trucks requires significantly more drivers, burns massive amounts of fuel, demands heavy military escorts, and drastically increases exposure to aerial surveillance. Moving supplies by train involves fixed tracks, known bridge crossings, and highly predictable transit schedules. Both systems are currently failing under immense pressure. The data paints a grim picture of this logistical starvation. Recent assessments indicate that the Ukrainian Middle Strike campaign is aggressively targeting logistical infrastructure located 20 to 200 kilometers behind the active front line. Commander Robert Brovdy publicly noted that military cargo traffic on the R-280 highway plummeted by an astonishing 71% in just 14 days. Even applying conservative estimates to this intelligence, the operational trend is undeniable. Kyiv is projecting lethal force deep into the rear staging areas. They are obliterating the exact locations where the Russian military attempts to organize, refuel, and prepare before launching offensive maneuvers. Now pull the tactical lens back from the burning wreckage of a destroyed fuel truck on the R-280 highway. Shift the perspective upward into satellite orbit. Looking down at the geography of northern Crimea reveals a series of incredibly narrow geographic choke points. As the primary asphalt and steel arteries harden or collapse, the entire Russian supply flow is funneled into these tightening bottlenecks. Armyansk, Chongar, Henichesk, and Mirin serve as the only remaining doors connecting the massive Crimean military warehouse to the active battlefields in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. These northern gates are no longer simple transit points. They are synchronized kill zones. In early June, a coordinated wave of Ukrainian strikes slammed into Chongar, Henichesk, Mirin, and Armyansk simultaneously. This was not a random application of firepower. Kyiv is not waiting for the Russian military to panic over one destroyed bridge. By striking multiple critical entrances at the exact same moment, they force Russian commanders to make impossible battlefield calculations. Leadership must decide which specific crossing receives emergency air defense coverage. They must choose which shattered road gets the engineering repair teams. They have to calculate which ammunition convoy crosses first and which vital fuel shipment must wait in the open. As these agonizing choices pile up, the entire supply network loses its most critical asset, momentum. The 1st Separate Assault Regiment of the Ukrainian military confirmed their direct involvement in striking these specific northern bottlenecks. These crossings are located roughly 50 to 75 miles directly behind the primary line of contact. That specific geographical distance is structurally important. It is far enough away to offer Russian truck drivers the psychological illusion of safety, but close enough for modern mid-range drones to hunt with devastating precision. The psychological comfort of the deep rear has been entirely erased. A Russian supply convoy no longer needs to be anywhere near a frontline trench to be completely annihilated. The physical reality of this campaign is written into the scarred landscape. Satellite imagery confirms cumulative structural damage near Chongar, Armyansk, and Henichesk. Desperate to keep the logistical flow alive, Russian engineering units have deployed temporary pontoon crossings alongside the shattered concrete bridges. But a pontoon bridge is not a permanent solution. It is a slow, highly fragile, and incredibly predictable choke point. Heavy military transports must drastically reduce speed to cross the floating platforms. Massive convoys are forced to idle in long lines along predictable approach vectors. That exact predictability is exactly what Ukrainian drone operators exploit. The true power of striking a logistical bottleneck lies in the resulting chaos. The Ukrainian military does not need to crater every single road in northern Crimea. They only need to render the primary passages fundamentally unreliable. When one crossing takes a direct hit, desperate traffic immediately shifts to the nearest alternative route. When that secondary route is struck, Russian engineers scramble to build a temporary fix. As hundreds of military vehicles cluster tightly around the fragile pontoon crossing, they form an unmissable target signature for loitering drones. The cycle of destruction repeats relentlessly. The frantic repair work, the massive fuel queues, the slow pontoon traffic, and the desperate air defense radar emissions all generate massive electronic and visual signatures. A concrete bridge can eventually be repaired, but the frantic repair operation itself acts as a massive beacon drawing in the next wave of precision strikes. The logistics suffocate, the supply chain breaks, and the entire front line waits for ammunition that will never arrive. With major highways turned into hunting grounds, Russian commanders are forced to push their massive logistics through narrowing geographic choke points. But are those gates still open, or are they walking into a final trap? What do you think Moscow will sacrifice next to keep their frontline units from starving? Drop your tactical assessment in the comments below. The localized friction has now metastasized into a systemic strategic paralysis. The logistics squeeze is violently bleeding through the military fences. It is directly impacting civilian stability across the entire region. Russian-appointed authorities in Crimea recently restricted gasoline sales to the general public and local businesses. They are desperately hoarding all available fuel strictly for government operations and essential security services. Sevastopol faces severe fuel price pressure and critical shortages. This internal strangulation shatters the protective propaganda shield. When ordinary drivers, local emergency services, and civilian transport operators feel the sudden shock of empty fuel pumps, the reality of the blockade becomes impossible for Moscow to hide. The war has arrived at their doorstep. The battle has also violently consumed the Kerch ferry system. British Defense Intelligence confirmed that Ukrainian strikes in the Kerch Strait area successfully eliminated critical air defense systems, localized fuel storage sites, and 3 heavy vehicle ferries. These massive ferries carry the practical weight of the war. They became absolutely critical when the main Crimean bridge faced severe transit restrictions and structural damage. Massive military trucks that cannot move freely across the damaged bridge span require immediate alternative transport across the strait. If these heavy ferries are disabled, delayed, or forced to permanently halt operations, the entire strait crossing network faces total systemic collapse. This escalating crisis places unprecedented pressure back on the Crimean bridge itself. The bridge remains a high-value target, but the wider Ukrainian campaign is making the defense of this structure a logistical nightmare. Russian commanders cannot simply protect the main bridge deck anymore. They are now forced to stretch their defenses to guard the sprawling approaches, the vulnerable fuel terminals, the ferry loading zones, the early warning radar installations, and the endless coastal roads feeding the crossing. It is an impossible defensive equation. Moscow is desperately responding with a massive deployment of high-value defensive assets. They deploy mobile air defense batteries, elite electronic warfare teams, massive chemical smoke screens, heavily armed patrol units, and localized military checkpoints. But military resources are strictly finite. Russia absolutely cannot place a Pantsir system, a massive S-400 missile battery, or a heavy electronic jammer beside every single bridge, every ferry, every supply train, and every fuel truck. Every single advanced air defense system pulled back to guard the Crimean rear is a critical system stripped directly away from the active front line. Moscow must rob their forward combat units of aerial protection just to ensure their logistics do not burn in the rear. The expanding operational range of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles ensures this problem will only escalate. Open-source intelligence heavily tracks the middle strike campaign, neutralizing targets 20 to 200 kilometers deep. Newer mid-range attack drones now operate effectively within the 30 to 300 kilometer class. The entire peninsula is now trapped inside an active UAV kill zone. The deep rear no longer exists. This is the brutal reality of an attrition campaign. A supply network does not need to be vaporized overnight. It simply needs to be degraded until its operational speed falls below the absolute minimum requirement of the frontline combat units. In the short term, the Russian military can still force supplies through the blockade. They will utilize complex detours, much smaller truck convoys, rapid engineering repair work, and strict nighttime movement protocols. But every single tactical adaptation carries a severe operational cost. Longer detour routes burn massive amounts of irreplaceable diesel fuel. Smaller convoys deliver significantly less artillery ammunition. Constant transit delays shatter the required firing tempo of the forward batteries. A convoy actively avoiding a damaged bridge exposes itself on a narrow, predictable secondary road. A stalled ferry crossing creates a massive, static cluster of heavy military vehicles just waiting for a drone strike. A destroyed fuel depot forces diesel tanker trucks to drive hundreds of extra miles, burning fuel just to deliver fuel. The logistical system is slowly suffocating under its own required friction. The political devastation perfectly matches the military disaster. Crimea is not merely a strategic supply zone. It stands as the ultimate symbol of Russian geopolitical power, established in 2014. Every massive fuel shortage, every delayed ammunition train, every burning ferry, and every shattered crossing forces a brutal question. If the Russian military cannot secure the most heavily fortified peninsula on Earth, can they hold the fractured front lines of the southern theater? Ukraine is not attempting to cut off Crimea in one single dramatic explosion. They are executing a methodical, relentless, and highly calculated pressure campaign. They will strike the bridges, the rail engines, the fuel depots, the maritime ferries, and the highway convoys again and again. They are forcing Moscow into a permanent state of desperate reaction. The peninsula remains geographically connected, but it is bleeding logistical strength with every passing hour. It has become entirely too exposed, exponentially too expensive, and tactically impossible to fully protect. Moscow faces an impossible equation: protect the rear and starve the front, or supply the front and lose the rear. How does a mechanized army survive when the very concept of movement becomes a fatal flaw? If this analysis helped you understand the battle more clearly, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more updates on war, weapons, and global politics.